In addition to the 6 Tudor royal burials at Westminster Abbey, there are several more whose location is either unknown or well hidden to the immediate eye. These royal children, whilst invisible in terms of a lack of memorial or monument that is at best unseen, we tend quite naturally to only look for those tombs which we know can be found. All of the children of Henry VI are buried at Westminster Abbey. Mary I and Elizabeth I, England's first two queens regnant, share a large tomb in the Henry VI chapel, although only bearing Elizabeth's monument. The Helft brothers' grave is recorded by a modern stone located most appropriately given his lineage to the west of the vault, which contains his paternal grandparents, Henry VI and Elizabeth of York. The first Tudor king and queen lie in the magnificent tomb created by the Italian sculptor Pietro Torrigino, who also designed the tomb of Henry VI's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, also buried at the Abbey. The Abbey somehow provides something of a diagram of the Tudor royal family tree in architectural form, but with one of its most important branches missing. Henry VIII is, of course, buried at St. George Chapel, Windsor, in a vault which he shares with his third, entirely beloved wife, Jane Seymour. Henry VIII's fourth queen, Anne of Cleves, is buried in a low stone sculpted tomb in the Sacrarium at Westminster Abbey, to the south of the high altar, an exalted location which befits her queenly status, one which comes at a price, whose her own monument is practically obscured by. Other monuments are overshadowed, of course, while the altar itself, its hallowed location aptly reflects the deeply held piety of Queen Anne, who was buried according to Catholic rites. At least 4 royal Tudor children, however, have almost vanished. Elizabeth of York, who predeceased Henry VII by 6 years, died on 11 February 1503, her birthday, at the Tower of London, as a result of childbirth. She was buried in the new Henry VII Chapel at Westminster Abbey, having fulfilled the age of 37 years, as the inscription reads on her tomb by Torrigino. Elizabeth of York's death was the tragic result of an admirable forbearance in the face of horrific personal tragedy, namely to conceive another child while still grieving for her eldest son, which she duly did, only a month after the death of Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, in 1502. We are both young enough to have more. In fact, Queen Elizabeth gave birth on February 1502 to a daughter, Princess Catherine, who died 8 days later. Despite her bold and brave attempt to give birth to new life in the wake of shocking personal anguish, Elizabeth of York herself too died, seemingly as the result of a postpartum infection. Queen Elizabeth's surviving children were, of course, as history now knows, Prince Henry, Duke of York, later King Henry VIII, Princess Margaret Tudor, future Queen of Scotland, and Princess Mary Tudor, future spouse of Louis VII of France and later Duchess of Suffolk. But there were other children. Tempting as a counterfactual argument can be, these children did not survive infancy and become the subject of intense discussion as to their future marital prospects alongside other ruling royal houses, so they are destined to remain historical question marks. Aside, however, from their dynastic value to their appearance as child chess pieces on the European Marriage Board, the royal children were still undoubtedly loved as children. The grief that had been felt over the death of Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, had been heartrending and extreme. It left the new Tudor dynasty, whose roots stretched no further back than the legitimate victory at Bosworth Field and Henry VII's distant descent through Henry V's queen, Father Anne of Valois, with the shaky reality that there was, in fact, only one remaining son that stood between Henry VII having no successor to the house he had established to rule England after his death. While there is no certain evidence to support the marriage of Catherine of Valois and Owen Tudor, the claim of the grandson that did result from the relationship, Henry VII, would certainly have been lent greater weight by the presumption that it had been legitimate. Claims were held to be strengthened through marriage with another blood claimant, similar to a thoroughbred mentality, hence the union of Henry Tudor with Elizabeth of York, thereby uniting the houses of Lancaster and York, the hitherto warring white and red roses being now the Tudor rose of a new dynasty. Henry VII's infant daughter, Princess Elizabeth Tudor, was set to marry the future King Francis I of France, for which discussions were already in place when she was an infant. Princess Elizabeth Tudor died at Eltham Palace, while her parents were at the Palace of Sheen on 14 September 1495, aged 3 years and 2 months. The cause was likely to have been a short, unspecified illness, probably thought not to have been serious, as both Henry V and Elizabeth of York were not summoned to Eltham and were still away when the child died. Princess Elizabeth died when Elizabeth of York was already in the 4th month of pregnancy with what would turn out to be another daughter. Princess Mary Tudor, future Queen of France and Duchess of Suffolk. Elizabeth was transferred in a black chair of 6 horses to Westminster. Her cortege was placed in the chawl, covered with a black cloth, fringed with red and white roses, and the words in gold, Jesus est mis. The grief-stricken inscription on the plate which was placed at the foot of her effigy says it all quite simply: death snatched her away. Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth spent the sum of £318 on her funeral, a vast sum according to the time and especially for Henry VII, who in public enjoyed a reputation for parsimoniousness, which clearly did not extend to his expression of private grief. The King and Queen did not attend the service. Princess Elizabeth's tomb consisted of a small chest of grey marble with a black marble slab on top. Her copper gilt effigy has not survived. Elizabeth's tomb, erected by her grieving parents, was 371 years old. It may be seen to the right of the altar, in front of the great shrine of St. Edward the Confessor, although its inscription is long since worn away, having begun to do so in the 1700s. The inscription, however, was fortunately recorded before it began to wear away, having previously been copied by the antiquarian John Stowe. So small is the tomb, however, that it could easily be overlooked. An infant princess, who had been a younger sister of the future Henry VIII, born the year after his birth in 1491. Thomas More wrote in his elegy on Elizabeth of York, a poignant tribute to the baby Elizabeth: Adieu, sweetheart, my little daughter late, thou shalt, sweet babe, such is thy destiny, thy mother never know. For here I lie, at Westminster, that costly work of yours, mine own dear lord, I shall never see. Elizabeth of York's baby son Prince Edmund and her daughter Princess Catherine, whom Elizabeth died after having given birth to in 1502, were both buried at Westminster Abbey, but no memorial exists to either, and the location of both is unknown. Poignantly, in the south aisle of the Lady Chapel, next to the tomb of Henry VII's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, is the monumental tomb of Mary, Queen of Scots, whose vault actually contains a vast amount of her descendants, who all share a resting place with their historically doomed ancestress. Amongst these are many children of the Stuart dynasty that followed the House of Tudor through sad irony, due to the Tudors' own distinct lack of philoprogenitiveness, who died in infancy, including the first 10 children of James II, the 18 babies of Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, all of who had meant to help secure her own dynasty. Elizabeth of York was the great first Tudor queen consort and is also the ancestress, of course, of the royal house of Stuart, through her daughter, Queen Margaret of Scotland, sharing the vault of Torrigino's tomb, not only with her husband Henry VI, but also her great-great-grandson, King James I of England and VI of Scotland, discovered when Ep Stanley, Dean of Westminster, ordered a search for the latter in 1869, when the vault was opened. But there is another child, whose birth was the cause of rapturous joy, who, had he survived, would undoubtedly have resulted in a very different reign for King Henry VIII, likely altering his urgent need for further marriages and perhaps making a marriage with Queen Anne Boleyn unnecessary, with enormous consequences for subsequent English history. One heir male could have temporarily comforted the king's dynastic anxiety, but would only have perpetuated the fear felt by Henry VII when his second son, Henry, Duke of York, was the sole male child to survive, leaving the burden of the succession on his young shoulders, because it was the same anxiety transferred to the next generation. By the time that Catherine of Aragon's pregnancies had ceased, Henry VIII's love of Anne Boleyn was a genuine coincidence of conscience, enabling him to probably subconsciously combine his passion for Anne with a passionate need to father an heir. The country celebrated with pageants and the Westminster tournament, recorded on its famous roll. Bells pealed throughout England. The baby prince died, however, on 22 February. He was buried at night at Westminster Abbey, attended by 10 children of the Chapel Royal. Lengths of black cloth were ordered. Henry VIII spent a lavish sum on the funeral of his son, burying the hope that had occasioned his birth. When finally Catherine of Aragon did bear a healthy child in 1516, a daughter, the future Mary I, Henry VIII bravely declared that by the grace of God, whose will follow, we are both still young. It was nearly an exact echo of the words roundly pronounced by Elizabeth of York on the death of his elder brother, Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, in 1502. The great wish of Henry VIII, the heartfelt Tudor longing for sons, was dashed by a miscarriage of Queen Anne Boleyn in 1536, just identifiable as having been a boy, but later fulfilled by Jane Seymour, with the birth in 1537 of the future Edward VI. As it happened, Catherine of Aragon's healthy child was the future Mary I, whose tomb, dominated by the vast memorial to her half-sister Elizabeth I, is in the abbey, not far from the presumed burial place of her baby elder brother, whose birth was greeted with such rejoicing. Jane Seymour's son, therefore, shares the great resting place of Westminster Abbey with the baby prince that Catherine of Aragon gave birth to, thereby fulfilling the hope of Henry VI 2 marriages later. The location of the burial of Henry, Duke of Cornwall, the beloved baby boy whose birth was attended with such national outpourings of joy, is believed to be in the sacrarium on the north side of the sanctuary, close to the entrance of the chapel of St. Edward the Confessor. Near, therefore, to the tombs of the child Princess Elizabeth Tudor and of Henry VIII's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, the architect George Gilbert Scott was engaged in the construction of a new high altar at Westminster Abbey in the 1860s, during which time a small lead casket of a child was discovered near to one of the steps. It was not disturbed, however, and there is no memorial or even an inscription, as the spot is only a supposed one. While these 4 royal children did not survive to maturity, their lives are still of great historical importance, despite the fact that there are no memorials to them, save for that erected by Henry VII for Princess Elizabeth Tudor. Indeed, one could be forgiven for not even noticing the latter, as there is not even an inscription. These children are mentioned generally as footnotes in the historical narrative, because so little is known and monuments to the other 3 were not made. As children of history, they are certainly not the only ones which have been forgotten in favor of their more well-known siblings who survived to adulthood, but they are surely still important, and the rest is history.